Thank you, Mr. Peed. Does the defense wish to open at this time? You may do so.
May it please the court. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what you've just heard from the prosecution reminds me of one of Aesop's fables that I first learned about when I was in high school. And that fable goes like this. A farmer who had gone into his field to mend a gap in one of his fences found at his return the cradle in which he had left his only child asleep, turned upside down, the clothes all torn and bloody, and his dog lying near it, besmeared with blood. Thinking that the animal had destroyed his child, he instantly dashed out his brains with the hatchet in his hand. When turning up the cradle, he found his child unhurt, and an enormous serpent lying dead on the floor, killed by that faithful dog, whose courage and fidelity in preserving the life of his son deserved another kind of reward. Now, what are the morals of this story? Number one is that we shouldn't jump to conclusions, and the other is that we probably shouldn't let emotions cloud our judgment. And I'm not here to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that Martin MacNeill deserves a reward like the faithful dog in Aesop's fable. Martin has made poor choices in his life. You've heard that he's had affairs during his marriage. You've heard that he was having an affair with someone named Gypsy Willis at the time that he was married to Michele. And that shortly after his wife passed away, he moved Gypsy Willis into the family home. And what are our reactions when we hear that, ladies and gentlemen? We may think he is a total jerk. That's absolutely disgusting. And that's natural. But it's very critical that during this trial you set aside your emotion and you evaluate this case based upon the facts of the case rather than emotion. You have heard testimony from the prosecution that Martin was loud and obnoxious, and we're not here to dispute that Martin was not an eccentric person. He was eccentric, and he is eccentric. And the prosecution is going to devote most of its time in this case trying to prove motive evidence, evidence of his affair with Gypsy Willis, which is akin to the evidence that the farmer misinterpreted as being proof of the dog's guilt. As in Aesop's fable, the prosecution's perception in this case is wrong, ladies and gentlemen. Martin MacNeill is not guilty. Let's look at the actual facts in this case and the science in this case. The real culprit in Michele's death, the serpent, as you will, was heart disease. Now, you've heard from the prosecution that they will present testimony from 3 different medical examiners. Number one was Dr. Fricke, who conducted the autopsy of Michele in 2007. Number 2 is Dr. Gray, who was the chief medical examiner for the state of Utah. And number 3 is Dr. Joshua Perper from Florida, who originally appeared on the Nancy Grace Show, which is a talk show dealing with various criminal cases in the country. And what you will hear, ladies and gentlemen, that while there are some disagreements among the medical examiners in this case, they all 3 agree on one thing. They agree that Michele's heart disease was either the cause or the contributing cause to her death. They agree on what is in the center of this chart. We have Dr. Fricke, Dr. Gray, and Dr. Perper. They all agree that terminal cardiac arrhythmia secondary to hypertensive cardiovascular disease may have caused Michelle's death. What an arrhythmia is stoppage of the heart due to hypertensive cardiovascular disease, which is commonly referred to as high blood pressure. And during this trial, you will hear about the damage to Michelle's heart. And this is significant because the damage to Michelle's heart couldn't have been caused by Martin MacNeill, and it couldn't have been known by Martin MacNeill. It's true that he knew that she had high blood pressure, but there's no way that he could have known about the significant damage to her heart that was found at her autopsy. And I bring this up because you heard the prosecutor state in opening statement that they believe that because Martin was a doctor, that he had some remarkable ability to make a death appear to be from natural causes when in fact something more sinister had occurred. What is very important in this case is that none of the medical examiners believed that Michelle's death was due to a homicide because there is a reasonable, natural explanation for Michelle's passing. So let's turn to Dr. Fricke. Again, Dr. Fricke was not paid as an expert by the state or the defense in this case. She conducted a detailed autopsy. She drew blood from Michelle's heart and preserved it. She took tissue samples from Michelle's heart, lungs, kidneys, and liver and preserved those samples. She had toxicology screens conducted on the heart blood that was drawn from Michelle's heart. And Dr. Fricke noted that the medications in Michelle's system were low and within therapeutic range. And on May 22nd, 2007, Dr. Fricke certified that Michele died from natural causes related to the objective autopsy findings of heart disease. Now, Dr. Fricke noted two types of heart disease in her autopsy report. One, as we discussed, was hypertension or high blood pressure, and that is not disputed in this case. What is disputed is the myocarditis. Myocarditis is inflammation of the heart. Now, this second type of heart disease is also serious, but its significance in Michelle's case, like I said, is disputed. But what is not disputed is what I've said is the center of this chart. Dr. Fricke also noted that Michele had fatty liver disease, and that will be discussed in the trial, and I ask you to listen to that testimony carefully. And you will hear, ladies and gentlemen, in this case, that the investigators in this case didn't like the science in this case because the objective science in this case shows a natural explanation for Michelle's passing. The investigators didn't like the science in this case, so they tried to get around the science. You will hear that investigator Doug Whitney told several witnesses that he had to get around the medical examiner in this case. And that's what the investigators set out to do in this case, was to get around the science and the medical examiners. Now let's turn to Dr. Gray, again, the chief medical examiner for the state of Utah. In September 2008, after Dr. Fricke had sadly passed away, the investigators asked Dr. Gray to reconsider Dr. Fricke's certification of Michelle's cause of death. And Dr. Gray, as he described, received oodles of information from investigators, including information about Martin's affair with Gypsy Willis. The investigators asked Dr. Gray to change Dr. Fricke's conclusions in regards to Michele MacNeill's death. Dr. Gray refused to do so. Instead, Dr. Gray sent an email back to the investigators and stated, while the investigation subsequent to Michele's death raises questions about the possible role of her husband, there is nothing in the autopsy or toxicology findings that proves her death was from an unnatural cause. The autopsy findings certainly provide evidence of natural disease that could explain death. The lung findings are non-specific and do not make me suspicious of drowning. The drug levels detected are not sufficient to explain death and are not indicative of an intentional lethal overdose. Now, the evidence in this case will show that the investigators were not happy with Dr. Gray's answer. And so they continued to court Dr. Gray over the next 2 years, having various meetings with him and trying to get him to change his opinion. So on October 6, 2010, Dr. Gray relented and modified Dr. Fricke's official cause and manner of death, but he did so very slightly. He amended the cause of death from being a heart arrhythmia or heart stoppage due to heart disease to a heart arrhythmia due to the combined effects of heart disease and drug toxicity related to the low levels of Valium, Percocet, Phenergan, and Ambien found in Michele's post-mortem heart blood. He amended the manner of death from natural causes to undetermined. He did not conclude that Michele's passing or that her death was due to homicide. Now, the medications that you heard Dr. Gray talk about and that you will hear the other medical examiners talk about will come up a lot during this trial. And there are synonyms for some of these drugs, so if you could take a moment to write down these names, I think it will help you during the trial. Valium is also known as diazepam. Percocet is synonymous with oxycodone. Phenergan is also known as promethazine. Promethazine. Ambien will also be referred to as zolpidem. And Lortab is the same thing as hydrocodone. Now, throughout the trial, you will also hear about something called post-mortem redistribution. You will hear during the trial that the low levels of medication in Michele's post-mortem heart blood or blood in her system after she died would have been even lower when she was alive. And this is because of a process called post-mortem redistribution. When a person dies, the medication that was stored in the person's muscle transfers back out into the bloodstream and moves towards the heart. And so at autopsy, when that heart blood is drawn, the blood levels that were in Michele's system, the Valium, Percocet, Phenergan, and Ambien, are expected to be higher in her system than the levels were in her system while she was alive. And you will hear that Michele's autopsy was not conducted for over 25 hours after her passing. which means that there was a lot of time for post-mortem redistribution to occur in her body. Now back to Dr. Gray. You will hear his opinions about the drugs in Michelle's system, and he believes that the drugs, you will hear that he had a lot of uncertainty and doubt about the effect the medications had on Michele. And he will testify that the low levels are not consistent with an intentional overdose. As recently as August of this year, just 2 months ago, an investigator approached Dr. Gray again, hoping that he would change his opinion about the medications in Michelle's system. Again, Dr. Gray refused to do so, and he noted that the drug concentrations are not very elevated in Michelle's system, that they were not elevated. So the drug levels in Michelle's system just were not very high according to Dr. Gray. Now, let's turn to Dr. Perper. You will hear evidence that the investigators were only partially successful in getting around Dr. Gray's testimony. So they hired another medical examiner to counter the Utah State Medical Examiner's opinions in this case. And you will hear that on December 7th, 2010, Dr. Perper appeared on the Nancy Grace show, and he disagreed with both Dr. Fricke and Dr. Gray and believed that Michele had drowned. So 10 months later, the Utah County Attorney's Office hired Dr. Perper to critique the Utah State Medical Examiner's opinions in the case. And Dr. Perper was given the same information that was given to Dr. Gray. Like on the Nancy Grace show, he concluded that Michele had drowned. However, like Dr. Gray and Dr. Fricke, Dr. Perper concluded that, what's in this chart here, terminal cardiac arrhythmia secondary to hypertensive cardiovascular disease could have been a contributory factor in the cause of death. In other words, he believed that heart disease could have played a role in Michele's death. And like Dr. Gray and Dr. Fricke, Dr. Perper did not say that Michele's death was a homicide. He found that her manner of death was undetermined because the objective science in the case showed that her death was consistent with natural causes. So I know some of this stuff is kind of confusing, but Dr. Fricke and Dr. Gray believed that an arrhythmia or a heart stoppage caused Michele's death. In 2010, Dr. Gray said that the low levels of medication in her system may have caused that arrhythmia. Dr. Perper believes that Michele drowned. But he agrees that there is evidence to support that Michele's heart disease due to high blood pressure may have caused the arrhythmia that led to her drowning, as opposed to Michele being forcefully drowned by somebody. And it's really not important whether Michele had an arrhythmia and died or whether she had an arrhythmia and drowned. Either scenario is still consistent with a death due to natural causes. What is important is that not one of these medical examiners has certified Michele's death to be due to natural causes. And what you won't hear in this case is equally important. You will hear that there's no evidence on Michele's body to indicate that there was a struggle. There are no unexplained needle marks on Michele's body. And you will hear during the trial that Alexis MacNeill said that Michele was not taking medication from Martin. Now let's talk about the myocarditis, which was the inflammation of the heart. In its next effort to try to get around the findings by the Utah State Medical Examiner, the Utah County Attorney's Office hired Dr. Cragen, who is a local cardiologist. Now, Dr. Cragen will testify that Michelle's dying of myocarditis is not wholly plausible, but he will also admit that he is not an expert in evaluating forensic evidence, and that he ultimately will defer to the medical examiners on their opinions of death in terms of the heart disease, in terms of the hypertension. Now, the evidence will show, ladies and gentlemen, that the investigators in this case conducted their investigation backwards. They started with the premise that Martin killed Michele. And that's why in the medical and scientific part of this case, they went to great lengths to change the autopsy report. And in the non-medical portion of this case, investigators cherry-picked certain parts of Martin's life that they perceived to be indicative of guilt. And as a result, in their zeal to try to prove their perceptions, the investigators engaged in practices that were not aimed at finding the truth. The investigators frequently interviewed witnesses together and encouraged witnesses to talk to each other. For example, Alexis was present during the interviews of both of her sisters, Vanessa and Rachel. Linda Clough, the sister to Michele MacNeill, was present during Alexis's interview. Paramedics were interviewed at the same time. Police officers were interviewed at the same time as well. Witnesses were told about investigative theories of the case, which tainted their objectivity. Witnesses were told about what other witnesses had said in the case. Now, the prosecution, as you have heard, will have many witnesses testify in this case, and these witnesses can be broken down into a number of categories. And these are the witnesses that attended to Michele on the morning of April 11th, 2007. There were neighbor witnesses who helped Martin get Michele out of the tub. There were police officers who responded to help when Michele passed away. There were paramedics who also responded and assisted Michele. There were emergency room staff that tried to save Michele. And there were also friends of the MacNeills that you will hear from. But the testimony you will hear from most of these witnesses will be based on perceptions that they formed years after the events related to Michelle's passing occurred, and after their perceptions had been influenced by information that had been provided by investigators, information provided by other witnesses, the media, because there's been a lot of media coverage on this case, or simply the passage of time affected these witnesses' memories. And you will see the unreliability of much of this eyewitness testimony, and that will be demonstrated at trial. You will hear testimony from some of the neighbor witnesses who can't recall what Michele was wearing that morning. Some will say that she was wearing a white top that was spaghetti strap type top. Others said that she had a white top. Others said that she had the t-shirt pulled up over her breasts. And others recall a black top. Most recall that Michele was not wearing any bottoms, except for one of the paramedics who recalls that Michele was wearing pink sweatpants. Now, this is the same person who stated that Martin stated that he had only been away from Martin for a short period of time. And that statement did not appear in any type of report, ladies and gentlemen. Now, you will hear a lot about the prosecution criticizing the manner in which MacNeill performed CPR on his wife. And we're not going to present any evidence that he did CPR perfectly, ladies and gentlemen. And few probably would in such a stressful circumstance, particularly when you're doing it on your spouse. And the prosecution seemed to find great significance in Michele throwing up on the police responders. But it's critical to know, and I ask you to listen to the testimony, this didn't occur until several minutes of performing CPR on Michele. It's not something that happened immediately when they started, but it was after some passage of time that this occurred. And the evidence will also show that investigators chose to interpret events that had a rational explanation, and they twisted those events into something sinister to fit their own perceptions in the case. Now, you'll hear about Martin's toe and the cane, and the prosecutor brought that up in opening. And the prosecution is going to suggest that Martin was limping and using a cane to stage that as a ruse that he wouldn't be able to lift Michele out of the bathtub. But the investigators ignored the medical and scientific evidence on this portion of the evidence as well. Martin has a condition called HNPP, which is a very painful toe condition. In the 14 months prior to Michele's passing, he had 3 surgeries on his toe. And he was told that there were concerns that he had masses on his toe that could be a tumor. Investigators ignored the fact that Michele was 180 pounds, and that even for a healthy person, lifting a 180-pound person out of a deep bathtub would be extremely difficult. Now let's turn to Alexis MacNeill. The evidence will show that Alexis has made multiple inconsistent and inaccurate statements about the events surrounding her mother's passing. And what you will learn in the next 4 or 5 weeks is that what Alexis does is she'll take something with a morsel of truth and she'll exaggerate it. For example, you heard the prosecutor state this morning that Martin over-medicated Michele 2 days after her surgery. And what he did is he understated that quite a bit. What you will hear is that at a prior hearing, Alexis testified that her mother was so over-medicated that she was in a comatose state until early that evening. And that she didn't speak until early in the evening. And because of that, she stood vigil by her mother all day, caring for her. But the objective evidence in this case does not support Alexis's story. The evidence will show, ladies and gentlemen, that Alexis kept a log of all of the medications that the prosecutor talked about, that her mother was taking each day, what she was taking and the time she was taking that medication. And on the day of this alleged over-medication incident, Alexis put in her log that she was giving her mother medication throughout that day, including pain medication. You will hear testimony and be shown evidence that is consistent with this, that on the day of Michele's alleged over-medication, which Alexis described as having her mother comatose until early in the evening, that at 9:45, the log indicates that she gave her mother eye ointment, that at 10 a.m., she gave Michele hydrogen peroxide and polysporin, that at 12:50 p.m., she was given methylprednisone, which is a pill that is taken orally by the mouth, supposedly when she was in a coma. At 2:45 p.m., Michelle's given oral medication again. She's given pain medication, Percocet. when she's supposedly in a coma. At 4 p.m. she's given cephalexin, which is also an oral medication. Again, at 5:15 p.m. she's given methylprednisone. And at 7:15 p.m. Michele is given more pain medication by her daughter, who stood by her bedside, stood vigil. During that day, throughout the day, she was giving her pain medication. And during this trial, you're going to hear so many different statements and different stories on different subjects that Alexis has given that are inconsistent. And Rachel as well is primarily a follower of Alexis. And she too does not hesitate to change important parts of her story to support her perceptions. Now, you will hear from inmates as well, ladies and gentlemen, and I agree with the prosecutor's statement that these inmates have checkered pasts. They not only have checkered pasts, they have a motive to be here and testify, because most of them were given certain benefits to say bad things about Martin MacNeill. Their testimony is not consistent with each other. And you will hear that they heard media reports in the jail of this case before they came forward with this evidence about Martin MacNeill. Now, I want to touch briefly on the 911 calls. You heard both of those 911 calls. At 11:46, Martin made the first 911 call very shortly after arriving home from picking up his daughter Ada from school. In that first 911 call, he was requesting an ambulance. The operator said an ambulance is on the way. At that point, he either hung up the phone or the call was dropped. At 11:48, Martin makes a second 911 call. Now, the prosecution will make a big deal out of this call, saying that it was staged. But I encourage you to listen to that 911 call again, and you will hear a frantic husband who wants to do CPR to save his wife. And the prosecution is going to claim, we expect, that Martin wasn't doing CPR on Michele. Yet the 911 operator is keeping him on the phone, making CPR difficult. The 911 operator then calls back. And while Martin is very frantic in this 911 call and is hard to understand at times, what is clear from these calls is that he just wants help. He wants an ambulance sent immediately to the house. So this brings us to the point of, what time did Michele die? The prosecution's own witness, the doctor that they hired from Florida, Dr. Joshua Perper, put in his report that Michele died within 1 hour of arriving at the hospital. She arrived at the hospital at 12:24 p.m., ladies and gentlemen, meaning that the earliest that Dr. Perper believes she died was 11:24 a.m. One of the reasons Dr. Perper feels that she died at this time is that Michele's rectal temperature shortly after arriving at the hospital was 35.7 degrees centigrade. And you will hear evidence that Michele had temperature measurements when she was alive that were even less than that 35.7 degrees centigrade temperature reading. During her plastic surgery, she had a temperature that was less than 35.7 degrees centigrade. In 2003, when she was in the hospital for another procedure, she had a temperature that was less than 35.7 degrees centigrade. In other words, Michele's body temperature tended to be lower anyway, which makes Dr. Perper's opinions regarding the time of her death based upon temperature even more likely. Dr. Van Wagner, the emergency room physician who attended to Michele, testified at the preliminary hearing that he thought that Michele would have died within an hour of arriving at the hospital. Again, 11:24 a.m. So where was Martin when Michele died? At 11 a.m., we know that he was in his office. He was making a phone call to Quest that lasted for 6 minutes. After that time, he made the short walk to go to the safety fair, not to get his picture taken, but to get an award. At 11:15, he received his award at the safety fair. You will hear from Melissa Frost that after he received the award, he continued to talk to vendors for approximately 5 to 10 minutes. You will also hear from a Jim Van Zant who talked to Martin that morning about 11:30, right before he left to go pick Ada up from school. So he probably picked Ada up around 11:35 that morning or a little bit later. At that point, when they arrive at the house, which was probably approximately around 11:45 a.m., Ada runs in and finds her mother in the bathtub. She summons her father, who attends to Michele, and he calls 911 at 11:46 a.m. Now, as you've heard the judge tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that what we say in opening, the prosecutor or I, is not evidence. And in the opening, the prosecutor stated certain things that we hotly dispute, and that I would ask that you just listen to the evidence and make your own determination. For example, when they're talking about disposal of the pills, it's very important that Martin had Eileen Hang and his son count out all of the pills and mark down in a log what pills were left, how many were left before they were flushed. They talked about a location in the bedroom that was particularly wet. Listen to the evidence. Michele MacNeill was moved from the bathroom to the bedroom where CPR could be performed. And that is the wet spot that was referred to. She was placed there to do CPR. And they've made a big deal about, Martin said that Michele was draped over the tub when Michele was discovered. I'd ask that you listen carefully to the evidence and look at the diagram that Alexis MacNeill prepared in regards to how she said her father discovered Michele in the bathtub. It indicates she was not draped over the tub. She was in the tub with her feet sticking out. That is the testimony, and I ask that you listen for that. And also, the prosecution has claimed that Martin gave in his funeral speech, he made some comment about what it was like to be a bachelor again. I would just ask that you listen to that and determine for yourselves if that was said by Martin during his funeral speech. Ladies and gentlemen, we realize this is a huge, huge inconvenience for you, that this is going to be a long trial and that you're all busy, you have families and jobs. And on behalf of Mr. Spencer and Mr. Martin and myself, we would like to thank you very, very much for your service. It's very much appreciated and it's very necessary. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, the prosecution, like the farmer in the fable, jumped to conclusions about Martin's guilt. But unlike the farmer who was willing to surrender his faulty perception in the face of the facts of the case, the prosecution has continued to cling to its faulty belief despite evidence in the case, including the medical evidence in this case, which shows that Michele MacNeill died of natural causes. the prosecution's perception is not supported by proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Martin MacNeill is innocent, ladies and gentlemen, and after you hear the evidence in this case, we will ask that you return a verdict of not guilty. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Ms. Guston. We'll now take our morning recess for 15 minutes. Ladies and gentlemen, please keep in mind my prior admonition to you. It's your duty not to discuss any subject of the trial with each other or with anyone else. It's your duty not to form or express an opinion on the case until it's finally submitted to you for deliberation. Avoid television, radio, or internet news coverage of the trial, if any, and do not use electronic communication devices to do personal research or to communicate with anyone about the trial. Court's in recess.